If you find this relentless uncovering of ambition, destiny, and the toxic mechanics of the American political dynasty compelling, this is only the beginning of our deep dive into the hidden history of the 20th century. We are committed to peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the complex, often uncomfortable human realities of the figures we call heroes and villains. To support our mission of high-quality, fearless historical investigation, please take a moment to like this video to help the algorithm find other history lovers. Subscribe to our channel and be sure to click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. And if you know someone who is fascinated by political intrigue, the psychology of power, or the hidden stories behind the textbooks, please share this content with them. Your support is the fuel that makes these detailed, long-form investigations possible, allowing us to resist the trend of superficial content and continue bringing these monumental, nuanced stories to light. Join our growing community of critical thinkers and become an active participant in exploring the lives that defined our modern world. The shadow cast by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s past was not just long. It was dark, toxic, and politically radioactive. The central question of JFK's rise is, how did a candidate carrying the baggage of a father known for virulent anti-Semitism, isolationism, and financial piracy manage to win? The answer lies in the ruthless control of the narrative and the brute force of unlimited capital. Joe Kennedy Sr. was a massive liability. His tenure as FDR's ambassador to London 1938 to 1940 was a catastrophe. He famously predicted that democracy is finished in England and advocated for appeasing Adolf Hitler to protect economic interests, a stance that bordered on treason in the eyes of the American public. To neutralize this, the Kennedy campaign, bankrolled by Joe Sr.'s bottomless checkbook, executed a strategy of purge and project. First, the purge. Joe Sr. was strategically erased from the public eye. He became the invisible man, running the campaign's finances and twisting arms in back rooms at the Hyannisport compound, but never appearing in photos or giving speeches. Second, the projection. The campaign aggressively manufactured the myth of JFK as a solitary, self-made war hero. The story of PT-109, the torpedo boat Jack commanded, that was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomons, was retold not just as a story of survival, but as a foundational epic of leadership, effectively drowning out the father's reputation with the son's heroism. They allegedly bought the pivotal West Virginia primary to prove a Catholic could win in a deeply Protestant state, effectively buying the electorate to silence religious bigotry. This was media manipulation on a scale never before seen, transforming a financial and political liability into an asset by burying the truth under a mountain of money and glamour. When John F. Kennedy finally swore the oath of office on that freezing day in January 1961, he was not just inheriting the presidency, he was inheriting an army of his father's loyalists and a governing philosophy defined by the family. The critical question is, what price did Jack have to pay to the dynasty for his throne? The price was the single most controversial and politically sensitive appointment of his administration: the naming of his younger, most ruthlessly ambitious, and fiercely loyal brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General. This was an act of raw, unapologetic nepotism that stunned Washington and enraged the establishment. Joe Sr. demanded it, insisting that Jack needed someone in the cabinet who belonged to him alone, someone who couldn't be fired, someone who would prioritize the family's survival over the law. Robert Bobby Kennedy's role was not merely that of the nation's top lawyer. He was the president's consigliere, his hatchet man, his shadow. He controlled the FBI, monitored the CIA, and acted as the gatekeeper to the Oval Office. However, this cynical appointment birthed a profound paradox. While installed to protect the family's secrets and maintain political controls, specifically to neutralize enemies like Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa, whom Bobby had pursued during the McClellan Committee hearings. Bobby's intense, brooding morality and his encounters with the brutal realities of the Jim Crow South transformed him. He turned the Department of Justice into a weapon for civil rights, sending federal marshals to protect freedom riders and forcing the integration of universities like Ole Miss. Thus, a move designed for dynastic self-preservation inadvertently unleashed the most significant moral force of the administration, proving that the ruthless Kennedy brother was also the most compassionate. At the very moment John F. Kennedy was standing at podiums, projecting an image of youthful vim and vigor to a captivated world. He was, in private, a man in agonizing physical disintegration. The question is, what was the full, terrifying extent of the secret medical crisis that the Kennedy machine conspired to hide? The public knew only of a war injury to his back. The hidden truth was a complex, near-fatal constellation of autoimmune and degenerative diseases. Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands. It left him with no natural defense against infection or stress. A condition that was historically fatal and caused his skin to turn a deep bronze tan, ironically misinterpreted by the public as a sign of health. His back was a ruin of osteoporosis and crumbling vertebrae, a side effect of the massive steroid doses used to keep him alive. He often had to wear a canvas corset so tight it restricted his breathing just to stand upright. To function, the President of the United States relied on a daily, hazardous regimen administered by the notorious Dr. Max Jacobson. Known in underground circles as Dr. Feelgood, Jacobson's secret formula, injected directly into the president's larynx or back before major speeches and summits, was a high-octane cocktail of animal placenta, bone marrow, painkillers, procaine, and heavy doses of amphetamine speed. This chemical prop was the only thing keeping him upright. The political necessity of the cover-up was absolute. Had the public known their commander-in-chief was one missed dose away from collapse, or that his judgment might be influenced by amphetamines during the height of the Cold War, his presidency would have ended instantly. This conspiracy of silence adds a layer of profound, tragic heroism to his tenure. The man who carried the weight of the free world could barely carry his own body. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is universally enshrined in history books as Kennedy's finest hour. The moment cool reasons saved the world from nuclear incineration. However, a deeper analysis asks, what role did the Kennedy family's unique psychology play in this near-miss? During those 13 terrifying days, the president faced a mutiny from his own military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by the cigar-champing General Curtis LeMay, viewed Kennedy as weak and demanded an immediate full-scale bombing and invasion of Cuba, move we now know would have triggered the launch of operational Soviet tactical nukes, obliterating the U.S. invasion force and starting World War III. Jack's political education, instilled by his father, taught him a cynical truth: never trust the experts or the establishment, relying on his brother Bobby as a back-channel diplomat and moral anchor. The Kennedys devised a strategy that humiliated their own generals to save the peace. They chose a naval blockade, quarantine, and move of supreme secrecy. Bobby brokered a deal with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin during a tense late-night meeting. The U.S. would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba, but privately, secretly, they would remove their own obsolete Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. This trade-off was kept secret from the American public and the U.S. military for decades to preserve Kennedy's image of toughness. The genius of the Kennedy strategy was its reliance on personal dynastic diplomacy over bureaucratic procedure, a willingness to subvert their own government, its chain of command to achieve a rational outcome during the darkest hours of Black Saturday. The myth of Camelot, that shimmering aura of high-culture youth and elegance, was not an accidental byproduct of the Kennedy presidency. It was a deliberate, meticulously engineered cultural product, and its architect was Jacqueline Kennedy. She arrived in a White House that was drab and historical unmoored, and she possessed a singular vision: to transform the American presidency into a global symbol of civilization that could rival the royal courts of Europe. Her strategy was a masterclass in soft power. She launched the massive White House Restoration Project, hunting down antiques and artifacts to turn the executive mansion into a living museum of American history. Giving the nation a visual anchor for its patriotism, she weaponized the arts, filling the East Room with Nobel Prize winners, cellists like Pablo Casals, and poets, signaling to the world that America was a superpower of the intellect, not just of commerce. Most critically, she used herself as a diplomatic asset. On the global stage, her fluency in French, her fashion, her regal bearing charmed rigid leaders like Charles de Gaulle and Nikita Khrushchev, softening diplomatic tensions in a way no policy paper could, most notably bringing the Mona Lisa to Washington for a historic exhibition. Jackie proved that style was not superficial, was a form of political currency. She created the stage upon which the Kennedy drama played out, constructing an image of perfection that was so blinding it effectively hid the cracks in the foundation. Behind the carefully curated images of the devoted father playing with his children in the Oval Office, John F. Kennedy's personal life was a minefield of reckless, compulsive promiscuity that constituted a massive ticking time bomb for national security. The primary question is, how did the most scrutinized man on earth get away with a lifestyle that would have destroyed any other politician? Kennedy's sexual behavior was not just affairs. It was a sense of entitlement and risk-taking that bordered on the pathological. His liaisons ranged from 19-year-old White House interns like Mimi Alford to dangerous entanglements with women who had direct links to the enemies of the state. The most glamorous was Marilyn Monroe, whose emotional instability and desperate calls to the White House switchboard became a major liability. But the most terrifying was Judith Exner, a woman who was simultaneously sleeping with the President of the United States and Sam Giancana, the violent boss of the Chicago Mafia. This love triangle created a direct line for blackmail between the Oval Office and organized crime. At a time when the CIA was secretly recruiting the Mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro, the cover-up required the full machinery of the state. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, used his files on Kennedy's indiscretions as leverage to keep his job. The Secret Service was turned into a procuring agency. The press, bound by the gentlemen's agreements of the era and the influence of Joe Sr.'s money and Frank Sinatra's connections, looked the other way. This shadow operation was the dark cost of the dynasty. A high-wire act where the president's private vices constantly threatened to bring down the entire government. The very moment John F. Kennedy was attempting to pivot his presidency, moving toward détente. With the Soviets and reconsidering the deepening quagmire in Vietnam, his life was brutally cut short in Dealey Plaza. The final question is, how did the assassination on November 22, 1963, not only kill a man but instantly decapitate a political organism? The Kennedy power structure was a wheel with Jack as the hub. When the hub was destroyed, the spokes shattered. The most immediate casualty was Robert F. Kennedy. In the span of 6 seconds, he went from being the second most powerful man in Washington to a grieving, powerless outsider. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been humiliated by the Kennedy brothers for years, moved quickly to strip Bobby of his influence and dismantle the Irish mafia that ran the West Wing. The assassination exposed the fatal flaw in Joe Sr.'s grand design. It was entirely dependent on the charisma and survival of one man. It also froze JFK in the American consciousness as a figure of unfulfilled promise. He never had to grow old, make unpopular decisions about Vietnam, or face the scandals of his private life. He remained forever young, forever the symbol of what could have been. This tragedy placed an unbearable, almost messianic burden on Bobby and later Teddy Kennedy to complete the unfinished work, turning the rest of the family's history into a doomed, tragic scramble to reclaim a stolen crown. The assassination in Dallas created a gaping wound in the national psyche, and into that void stepped Jacqueline Kennedy to perform one final act of narrative magic, the creation of Camelot. In a carefully controlled interview with Theodore White for Life magazine just days after the funeral, she quoted her husband as favorite line from the musical, "Do un let it be forgot," that once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot. This was not history. It was myth-making. She consciously framed her husband's messy, pragmatic, incomplete administration as a legendary era of King Arthur, a time of perfect knights and noble causes cut short by evil. The public, desperate for meaning amidst the horror, embraced this myth instantly. However, for historians, the legacy is a profound American paradox. The Kennedy years were a mix of genuine high ideals, the Peace Corps, the rhetoric of service, the survival of the missile crisis and a dark underbelly of election theft, mafia collusion, and assassination plots. The enduring power of the Kennedy name lies in this tension, the fact that their soaring rhetoric of freedom and justice was often bankrolled by the darkest arts of politics. It forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that in the real world, The most noble ends are sometimes inextricably bound to the most ignoble means. Shifting our gaze from the theater of American politics to the theater of the operatic stage, we encounter an ambition that rivals even the Kennedys in its scale and audacity. Who would dare to conceive of a single, unified work of art that spans 4 nights, requires 15 hours to perform, and consumes 26 years of a creator's life? This was the megalomaniacal vision of Richard Wagner in his magnum opus, Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung. This was not merely an opera. It was a festival play, a new religion of art intended to regenerate the German soul. Wagner, a revolutionary who had once been exiled for fighting on the barricades in 1848, poured every ounce of his philosophy, his ego, and his genius into this work. The cycled ass Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried, and Jeter Meering is a reimagining of the ancient Nibelungenlied and Norse Eddas, influenced by the pessimism of Schopenhauer. It tells the cosmic story of a cursed golden ring forged by a dwarf who renounces love to gain power. A ring that inevitably destroys every god, hero, and giant who touches it. It is a profound, pessimistic allegory about the corrupting nature of unchecked power. The dehumanizing force of industrial capitalism, represented by the enslaved Nibelungs, and the inevitable collapse of the old order of the gods, Wotan. Wagner's ambition was to create a total artwork Gesamtkunstwerk that would unite music, poetry, drama, and visual spectacle into a single, overwhelming experience that would change the world. To realize a vision this colossal, Wagner knew that no existing theater in Europe was adequate. He needed a temple built specifically for his rites. He founded in the sleepy Bavarian town of Bayreuth, where he built his own theater in his villa, named Wanfried Peace from Illusion. Wanfried became more than a home. It was the headquarters of a cult of personality that would have disastrous consequences for the 20th century. Here Wagner lived with his second wife, Cosima von Bülow, the illegitimate daughter of Franz Liszt. Their union was forged in scandal. She left her husband, Wagner's disciple Hans von Bülow, to be with the master, but it became a partnership of terrifying ideological power. Cosima was the high priestess of the Wagner cult, recording his every word in her diaries and enforcing strict loyalty. Together, they hosted the Wanfried Circle, a salon of intellectuals, nationalists, and sycophants who cultivated Völkisch ideology, mystical blood-and-soil nationalism that viewed the German spirit as superior and endangered. They championed the works of Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the fathers of scientific racism. In the drawing rooms of Wanfried, the sublime beauty of Wagner's music was fused with a toxic philosophy of racial purity and anti-Semitism, laying the intellectual groundwork for the German nationalist movements that would eventually coalesce into Nazism. This leads to the fiercest and most painful debate in music history. Is Wagner's bigotry merely a personal flaw, or is it encoded directly into the DNA of his art? A close reading of the Ring Cycle suggests the latter. The villains of the piece, the Nibelung dwarves Alberic and Mime, are not just generic bad guys. They are constructed using the specific, hateful anti-Semitic tropes Wagner outlined in his notorious essay Judaism in Music. They are depicted as physically grotesque, obsessed with gold, manipulative, whining, and crucially incapable of true creation or love. Alberic can only forge the ring by renouncing love. Mime can only copy swords, never forge a new one. Their music is often jerky, staccato, and mocking, utilizing what critics call Jewish stuttering Mauchel, not contrasted with the soaring, lyrical, natural melodies given to the Germanic heroes. Siegfried, the fearless blonde boy hero who slays the dragon and mocks the dwarf mime, is presented as the ideal Aryan man, impulsive, uneducated, physically perfect, and acting on pure instinct rather than Jewish intellect. This suggests that the brilliant and the bigot are indivisible. When we cheer for Siegfried and laugh at Mime, Wagner is manipulating us into participating in his racial worldview. The prejudice is woven into the leitmotifs themselves, making the appreciation of his genius an ethically treacherous act. Wagner's revolution was not limited to music. Fundamentally redesigned the physical experience of theater to serve his ideological goals. He built the Bayreuth Festspielhaus on the Green Hill with a specific purpose: to force the audience into a state of total passive submission to the artwork. He located it in a remote town to ensure that attendees had to make a pilgrimage, severing ties with their daily lives. Inside, he abolished the class hierarchy of the traditional opera house. There were no private boxes for the aristocracy to be seen in, only rows of simple seats, the democratic seating all facing the stage. His masterstroke was the mystic Gulf Mystischer Abgrund, a hidden orchestra pit that concealed the musicians and the conductor from the audience's view. In traditional opera, watching the drummer or the conductor's baton was a distraction. In Bayreuth, the music swelled up from the darkness, charismatic and disembodied, bypassing the intellect and hitting the emotions directly. He darkened the auditorium, completely a radical innovation at the time, forcing the audience to focus solely on the illuminated stage, like a collective dream or a religious hallucination. This was the invention of the immersive experience, temple where the individual ego dissolved into the collective will of the audience. A powerful tool for artistic and later political mass manipulation. In the summer of 1876, the eyes of the world turned to Bayreuth for the inaugural festival, the premiere of the complete ring cycle. It was the cultural event of the century, a coronation of German art timed to coincide with the recent unification of Germany under Prussian rule. The guest list was a testament to Wagner's supreme status: Kaiser Wilhelm I, Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, Friedrich Nietzsche, and rival composers like Tchaikovsky and Liszt made the trek. The festival was a logistical nightmare. The scenery arrived late, the dragon prop was a disaster, the neck was missing. Arriving from London too late, and the heat inside the unventilated theater was suffocating. Yet historically and ideologically it was a triumph. It established Bayreuth as the spiritual center of the new German Reich, proving that German art could rival the classical dominance of Italy and France. It cemented the dangerous idea that the German nation was not just a political entity, but a spiritual community bound together by myth and art. The festival lost a fortune, but it won the war for the German soul, creating a mechanism for nationalistic expression that would be exploited by darker forces in the decades to come. After the Herculean effort of the Ring, Wagner composed one final, enigmatic and deeply controversial work, Parsifal, 1882. He refused to call it an opera, naming it a stage-consecrating festival play and banning its performance outside of Bayreuth. It is a work of overwhelming, shimmering beauty, telling the story of the Holy Grail and the Knights of Montsalvat. The knights are dying because their king, Amfortas, has been wounded by the Holy Spear after falling into sexual sin. Only a pure fool, Raintor, Parsifal, a boy with no knowledge of sin, can retrieve the spear and heal the wound. While the surface themes are Christian compassion, baptism, redemption, the subtext is obsessed with the purity of blood. The villain Klingsor is a self-castrated sorcerer, and the wild woman Kundry is a figure of racial ambiguity. Many scholars, and indeed the Nazis later, interpreted Parsifal as a parable of racial cleansing. The pure blood of the Aryan Brotherhood must be saved from the corrupt blood of the lower races. Friedrich Nietzsche, Wagner's former friend, vomited metaphorically upon hearing it, calling it a sickening collapse into holiness and a betrayal of the life-affirming paganism of the Ring. Parsifal remains the most difficult of Wagner's works to grapple with. A masterpiece of orchestration that seemingly sanctifies a terrifying ideology of exclusion. Why does the moment Luke Skywalker stares at the twin suns of Tatooine feel so profoundly emotional? Why does the Imperial March instantly evoke dread? It is because John Williams, the composer of Star Wars, practically transcribed the textbook of Richard Wagner for the cinema. Wagner's influence on the 20th and 21st centuries is pervasive, but nowhere is it more alive than in film music. Wagner invented the leitmotif short, recurring musical phrase attached to a character, an object, the ring, the force, or an emotion. Before Wagner, opera was often a series of disconnected songs. Wagner wove a continuous tapestry of sound where themes morphed, combined, and battled each other, acting as a psychological narrator, telling the audience what the characters were feeling, but not saying. When you watch a modern blockbuster, the way the music swells to manipulate your pulse, the way a theme hints at a character's destiny before they know it themselves. That is the technology of Bayreuth. Wagner understood that music could bypass the rational brain and program the emotional response of the audience, a technique that is now the standard operating procedure for everything from Hollywood movies to political attack ads. we finally arrive at the darkest, most radioactive chapter of the Wagner legacy, his posthumous adoption as the spiritual father of the Third Reich. This was not an accidental appropriation. It was a willing alliance forged by the Wagner family. Adolf Hitler was a fanatic of Wagner's music from his youth, claiming that whoever wants to understand National Socialism must know Wagner. He saw in the operas a blueprint for his Reich, the hero worship, overthrowing of old orders, the racial purity, the apocalyptic struggle. When Hitler rose to power, Winifred Wagner, the composer's daughter-in-law, opened the doors of Wanfree to him. He was Uncle Wolf to her children, a beloved family friend who visited the gravesite of the master. Bayreuth was transformed into Hitler's court theater, a state-sponsored shrine where the Nazi elite gathered to worship at the altar of German art. The music was weaponized. Die Meistersinger was performed at the Nuremberg rallies to whip up nationalist fervor. But the ultimate horror was the use of Wagner's music in the concentration camps, where it was played over loudspeakers to re-educate prisoners or accompany them to forced labor. By linking his sublime music so inextricably to the machinery of genocide, the Nazis and the Wagner family committed a cultural crime from which the composer's reputation can never fully recover. We are left, then, with the most agonizing, unresolvable paradox in the history of Western culture. Can we separate the art from the artist? In the case of a painter who was a jerk, perhaps. But with Richard Wagner, the hate is not just in the man, it seems to be in the art itself. His anti-Semitism and xenophobia were the engines that drove his creative process, integral to his vision of a purified German culture. Yet the music, the opening chord of Rheingold, the prelude to Tristan contains moments of such transcendent, aching human beauty that they seem to touch the divine. We are forced to hold two contradictory truths in our heads simultaneously: that Richard Wagner was a moral monster who helped pave the way for the Holocaust, and that he was one of the greatest musical geniuses who ever lived. In Israel, the ban on performing Wagner is a visceral reminder that for survivors, this music is the soundtrack of death. For the rest of us, Wagner remains a permanent burden, a warning that aesthetic beauty acts as no guarantee of moral truth. We must listen to him with our eyes open, resisting the seductive pull of his ideology while acknowledging the terrible power of his creation.